everyone, and thank you all for being here today for our Human Rights in Practice event, Access to Healthcare in Prisons During the Pandemic. And our event today is sponsored by the Duke Law International Human Rights Clinic, the Center for International Comparative Law, and a host of other co-sponsors, including the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Keenan Institute for Ethics, the Duke Law Health Justice Clinic, and several student groups, the Health Law Society, the Human Rights Law Society, the International Law Society, and the Latin American Law Students Association. So thank you all very much to our co-sponsors. And I will now introduce our speakers for today. We have Fábio Amado De Souza Barretto, a Brazilian public defender and the head of the Human Rights Department at the Public Defense Office in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And Mr. Amado is based in Rio. We also have with us Irmina Pacho, who is the Associate Legal Officer in the Litigation Team with the Open Society Justice Initiative. And Ms. Pacho is calling in from Berlin today. Our format for today's event will be a moderated Q&A with our two speakers for the first 30 minutes or so. And following that, we very much look forward to your questions. So please share your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and I will read out the questions to our two speakers. So starting with our questions, first to Fabio. Fabio, in April and May of this year, the public defender of Rio de Janeiro, where you are the head of the Human Rights Department, as well as the Public Prosecutor's Office of Rio, filed two collective actions against several entities: the State of Rio, the Municipality of Rio, and also an organization that manages healthcare in prisons. And one of your collective actions argues for rapid intervention to address the situation in Rio's prisons resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. And the second action asks for more transparency and data about the health conditions of inmates because prison staff had refused to provide this information. Can you share with us some more explanation about the case, including some of the remedies that you're calling for, and also any updates on where the case stands currently?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. I would like to thank Duke Law School's Center for International and Comparative Law and International Human Rights Clinic and the co-sponsors. I brought a brief presentation. I would like to ask for Isabel's help to share with us this presentation. Thank you. Well, we're talking today about this healthcare in prison during the pandemic, focusing on Brazilian prison system. Yeah, next, please. Let me bring a little bit of background. Yeah, everybody knows Brazil is located in South America, and it's a country with continental dimensions like US. Here we have the 26 states of our federation, a tiny little square in the middle, our capital, federal capital, and Rio de Janeiro is located at the southeastern of the country, the little lion here. Rio de Janeiro was once the federal capital, remains to be the cultural capital of Brazil. But Rio City is the capital of the state of Rio de Janeiro. It's an amazing place, forests, beaches, mountains, and urban forests. It's the landscapes are amazing. Next, please, Isabel. And I want to explain a little bit about my organization. A public defender, a human rights lawyer, and the Public Defender's Office in the state of Rio de Janeiro is the largest and the oldest of these offices that provide legal aid and offers full and free legal assistance and guidance to vulnerable citizens and those who cannot afford to pay for legal aid service. We provide legal aid for refugees, migrants, elderly people, children, any victim of gender-based violence, domestic violence, racial prejudice, discrimination, sexual discrimination, victims of police brutality, torture, enforced disappearance. And this encompasses the free access to legal assistance, covers attorney fees, expert fees, legal or out-of-court expenses. Our staff is about 770 public lawyers, and we are totally public funded. The state of Rio de Janeiro is responsible, is in charge of providing us with this fund. And there are some particular features from Brazilian public defender's office, because we can, although all our funds are public, we can file, and it's set in the law, but we can file lawsuits against the state of Rio de Janeiro, against the Rio municipality, and in general, public defenders can file lawsuits against the federation. We can also do international litigation, and we've been learning a lot from our friends from Open Society Justice Initiative in this specific issue as well. We can file collective actions, and this empowers the institution to be far beyond just providing legal aid to people who cannot afford to pay for legal aid service. And the range is big. Like we provide legal aid from housing, family issues, to criminal defense. Okay. Please, Isabel. Brazil. Brazil is the third largest prison population in the world, behind only United States and China. But actually, we don't know for sure if we can say that these figures, these numbers are not accurate, but at least 773,000 people are incarcerated in Brazil. Collecting data and accurate data here from the official and public branch is a big concern for all of us, because the National Council of Justice provides this number and identifies that there are at least 773,000 people, but we don't know for sure. There is another important national database that explains that, in fact, we in our prison, we can find at least 850,000 people. So even the official data regarding the number of persons deprived of liberty, we don't know for sure. And this is very problematic. This is worrisome. And Brazil, 40% of these detainees, the prisoners, are pretrial detainees. And people who are Black, of low social economic status, and of low educational attainment are more likely to be incarcerated. In Brazil, the current prison system, it functions to reinforce and exacerbate societal inequities, with these marginalized groups overrepresented. That's the point. The structural institutional racism that is in the roots of our own history is very clear and well represented in prison system. The runaway growth of the incarcerated population in recent years has led, of course, to severe overcrowding. And this rampant overcrowding has also led to extremely poor sanitation conditions, poor hygiene, lack of water supply. Even basic necessities like soap and toothpaste are frequently not provided, and prisoners complain of being underfed and served spoiled or uncooked food. Even the lack of beds force some of them to lie on the floor on these scraps of cardboard, and even in some detention facilities, there's no floor, there's no room, and they tie themselves by sheets to the cell bars to sleep. So the combination of unsanitary conditions, intermittent water supply. I've been to many detention facilities in my state, and the water supply was like 15 minutes twice a day, and that's it. This is the water they receive to drink, to wash the personal items, to try to take a shower. So we have this intermittent water supply, poor provision of basic necessities, this severe overcrowded places. Combined, it was awful before the pandemic, but with this, during this pandemic, everything was aggravated. And please, Isabel, next. I'll show you here the official numbers from the National Council of Justice, okay? But we cannot rely on this. This is our number from the National Council of Justice and National Penitentiary Department. But here, the public power is, the strategy they are using is just like that. They are not testing. The numbers are lower than the real situation. Then they say that the measures that they have been taking are effective, are adequate. So this is the monitoring, and this is weekly of cases of contagion and death by COVID-19 by this important national institutes. But it's important to stress that the actual figures could be significantly higher given the failure to gather and report accurate data. Here we see they state that there are so far 199 deaths registered and 39,595 cases confirmed, okay? And down we have, thinking about prison staff, personnel, 9,995 cases confirmed, 84 deaths. Persons deprived of liberty, prisoners, 29,600 cases confirmed, and just 115 deaths. Next, please. This is a graph showing that here, the first line, persons deprived of liberty, the cases that are so spiking, although there is no accurate data, is growing fast. And the orange line down here, the deaths. This is the last report. This is from October 5th. We have here, as I said before, 115 deaths. Next, please. Testing. There is the lack of sufficient testing in detention facilities is a further indication of likely underreporting in infections and COVID-19 related deaths. Let me show here just RJ, Rio de Janeiro. These are tests divided by the states. In my state, persons deprived of liberty, how many tests they performed? They test just 2,563 detainees. We have around 46,000 persons deprived of liberty, just in my state. We're talking about less than 6%, less than 6% of detainees have been tested for the virus. And staff, personnel, 1,961 as the second board, like the line where we can see RJ. And staff, we can talk about 5,000 here in my state, and testing was almost 2,000 have been tested. So they're not testing. We call for like mass testing. They're not testing even symptomatic individuals. And when, please, Isabel, next. Okay. So the specific situation and the vulnerability of persons deprived of liberty was already awful and got worse during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's a consequence of both structural deficiencies in prison system, largely stemming from high degrees of overcrowding, and of a failure to implement timely prevention and response measures to prevent the spread of the virus. So before we filed this collective action, we had this scenario. The main problems and concerns. First of all, lack of space to enable adequate social distancing. Inappropriate medical care. Most prisons do not even have doctor on staff, a physician. So lack of space, inappropriate medical care, lack, of course, of sufficient testing to detect the virus. You're not testing even the symptomatic individuals. And if you don't test, you cannot isolate, and you're not confirming and not tracking, and there's no quarantine, and lack of equipment, PPE, and basic items to ensure adequate protection and hygiene. Because of course, the best is you gotta reinforce good hygiene practice, disinfection, but if you have no supply of water, how can you get there? And to get worse, they are and they weren't notifying the case, confirmed or possible case of COVID-19 among detainees or staff. So this was the dire situation. And then, first of all, we tried to reduce the size of the prison population that is critical to combat the spread. So we filed lots of habeas corpus, collective habeas corpus, and we managed to substantially reduce the number of elderly people deprived of liberty. More than 80% of elderly people that were, when the pandemic started, we were able to get them out of the jail, and this was good. But not enough. We're talking about now 46,000 people just here in my state. So we first of all identified that the medical staff, the whole medical staff to the state penitentiary system, we're talking about 27 doctors to 46,000 people. And this gets worse because the nurse union informed us that in fact, there were only 8 doctors working during the pandemic to provide medical care to 46,000 people in 51 detention facilities. 8 physicians. And the thing is, last month, our state parliament passed the law determining the testing of all inmates. It was a good step, we're happy with, but the governor, the sitting governor, vetoed the bill. The governor said it's not necessary. The budget is limited and we don't need to improve and develop and implement the mass testing. So we filed this collect action, and the judge dismissed the provisionary measure. And the thing is, and we've been learning a lot with Open Society, our great partner. We filed this lawsuit, and we knew since the very beginning that it would be quite difficult to the judge to grant all our requests that were very wide and comprehensive. But it was an important and powerful tool to keep on negotiating with the secretariat, the executive branch, and to put pressure in their shoulders. And this was quite important because we initially lost the precautionary measures. We filed a motion, it's pending judgment. But the thing is, the state replied, the state of Rio de Janeiro replied, trying, and the argument was that we were attempting to interfere in public policies. And the policies were perfect, adequate, because you can see we have a very low number of deaths. Of course, the data is inaccurate. They're not testing. A lot of people die in custody, and we don't know for sure the reason. Is unknown. They're not testing no one. So, but the thing is, although the ruling was not in our favor initially, of course, we managed to put pressure into the executive branch, and they provided PPE for staff, soap for detention facilities, and remember, there were just 8 doctors for the whole prison system for 46,000 inmates. And we managed to get medical care with full medical teams now in the 3 worst detention facilities. And this action was quite important to move forward this policy that has never been implemented before. And we have now, talking to the state and the Rio municipality, the next 2 units that will be provided with medical care and a full medical team will be the women units. So it seems like a tiny step, but it's so important because they have never had such a thing. So, and in some detention facilities, they managed to organize the room, the space, and now we have some isolation rooms, not in every unit, but we can see that we are moving forward, and this collective action was quite important for that. The other collective action was regarding transparency. And in this case, the precautionary measure was granted because we requested the presentation of the documents and information regarding health conditions of the prisoners. They were denying and turned down our requests, and with this judicial mediation, we're receiving the medical bills, medical records, as it's written here in the presentation. The first one, we requested for like providing tests, medical teams in each prison unit, make available space for isolation, ensure proper treatment to confirm the suspect case. All these things are moving forward. And the next one, please, Isabel, is the second one that's related to transparency. We requested them to provide documents related to persons with private liberty, health conditions, such as medical reports, medical care bulletins, medical records, and general information on the state of inmates' health, and also oblige them to make it mandatory, release weekly a report on the transmission of the coronavirus in all prisons, infected, suspected cases, etc., and the precautions adopted. So this was very important, and we couldn't have this without the partnership with open society and a lot of amicus, professors, health professionals, and we're also working with the public prosecutor's attorney that here, like Defensoria Publica, is not limited to penal, to criminal issues. They can also file collective actions, and we work together, this joint work of public institutions, Brazilian public institutions, Rio de Janeiro public institutions, with Open Society Justice Initiative, and a lot of great professors is very challenging. is a fight, is an endless fight when we're talking about rights of persons deprived of liberty here in my country. But this has been so important, and it's been very fruitful.
Thank you so much, Fabio, and for that helpful segue to Irmina. So Irmina, your organization, the Open Society Justice Initiative, filed an amicus brief, as Fabio just mentioned, along with 2 Brazil-based NGOs. And the brief draws heavily on both international and regional human rights law and jurisprudence to support the argument that the Brazilian government must protect those who are in prison during the pandemic. Can you talk us through why you decided to become involved in the case in the first place, including why, as you've discussed, some of your arguments constitute an innovative approach to litigation, and also a little bit about what the nature of these international human rights arguments were?
Great. Thank you, Aya. And first of all, I just wanted to thank you all for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. So regarding the first part of your question on why OSJI, together with Brazilian-based organizations, Connectas and LS Existem, filed the amicus curiae brief in this case that Fabio just described. So I think since the beginning, since the outbreak of the pandemic early this year, states implemented drastic measures to protect people. But what we also observed is that there has been like this national urgency to mitigate the effects of COVID-19, particularly to the prison population. We saw that all countries, or most of the countries around the globe, were facing similar issues and struggling with similar problems. So in a way, the need to protect the prison population is not exclusive for Brazil. It's much wider, and we can observe it in many places in the world. But from the litigation perspective, the fact that Brazil is the 3rd largest prison population in the world, what Fabio just mentioned, the fact that we have the well-established partnership with Defensoria Publica in Rio, and as well as the fact that the case is so much well advanced and that it's a collective action asking for a very broad remedies. All these factors guided us in making a choice to intervene in the Rio case. Our role was to support the arguments of Defensoria in terms of the remedies that Defensoria is asking for, and also to bring additional international as well as comparative perspective. So in terms of the situation, when we look at the situation of prisoners, my organization is of the position that the first urgency for the state during the pandemic, during the public health crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic, is to reduce the number of people in detention, thus to reduce, to release people, to reduce the problem of overcrowding, and to put in place a social distancing. But also there is this question that what about those who remain in detention, as obviously not everyone can leave the prison. So in our amicus brief, we argued that under the human rights standards, the duty to protect life and health of incarcerated persons is even higher, since people remain under the jurisdiction and within the power of the state. So overall, we wanted to use this case to push the Brazilian state and to support Defensoria to push the Brazilian state through the court's order to put in place already existing obligations under international and regional human rights law systems that should have been there already way earlier, but are not, as we just heard from Fabio. So our main argument here was also centered on the fact that the right to healthcare in prisons is a fundamental human rights, for incarcerated persons, and every person in prison should be offered the same standard of healthcare as is available to the general public. Also, the access should be free, free of charge, fair, transparent, and should be effective and meet the medical needs of prisoners. And in some instances, failure to provide healthcare can violate several other fundamental rights, such as the right to health, life, as well as the prohibition of torture. But the question that was actually the most important for us when we were thinking of how to, what we can bring to the court, what it was actually, the question, what it actually means, the right to healthcare in detention in the times of pandemic. And here the difficulty appeared for us in a way how to frame the specific recommendations, because we can draw from international and regional human rights standards, but since we were dealing, and we are still dealing, with a public health emergency, this needs to be somehow framed differently. So what we did is that we decided to adopt this public lens health in addition to the human rights standards. And so our analysis and recommendations draw not only on this international and regional human rights standards on healthcare in detention, but we also focused on epidemiological analysis of experts associated with Physicians for Human Rights, Yale and Stanford universities, as well as Osvaldo Cruz foundations. We heavily related on recommendations of the World Health Organization, and also on good practices from other jurisdictions. And here we relied on expert opinions from Ireland and Italy. All these opinions are submitted to the case along with the Defensoria's submissions. So I mentioned difficulty because, as you might know, recommendations of World Health Organization, these are not legal recommendations. These are policy recommendations that might, but equally might not be followed by states. So, this is still like the approach that we are kind of testing and willing to see how the Brazilian court will respond to that. We also claim that having this very strong public health lens to the human rights obligations in the context of pandemic is the only feasible option for states that is available to mitigate the COVID-19 risks. So therefore, based on the legal standards, that the right to health is not only limited to treatment, but it includes access to preventive medicine and adequate sanitary conditions. And then based on the whole bunch of recommendations from the WHO, we actually supported the arguments of Defensoria, and we also recommended that the state of Rio de Janeiro need to immediately implement the following measures, which are the physical distancing measures to ensure the adequate living space for prisoners and non-punitive isolation spaces whenever it is necessary for people to go into quarantine. We also recommended to introduce comprehensive kind of universal testing of prisoners for COVID-19, access to free distribution of personal protective equipment, so here face masks, and also distribution of hand sanitizers and other sanitation products, not only to prisoners, but also to prison staff. We also indicated that particularly in the context of the pandemic, it is necessary to allow prisoners to be transferred to public hospitals whenever it is necessary. We also made this argument that public information, information regarding COVID-19 restrictions in prisons should be transparent and should be provided to prisoners. All these measures should be transparent in order to avoid riots within the prison systems, which we actually observed in a few countries at the beginning of the outbreak of the pandemic. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Irmina. And we have a couple more questions for both of our speakers, but in the meantime, if people in the audience would like to go ahead and submit your questions already, please feel free to do so. So turning back to you, Fabio, both of you alluded to the fact that there were a host of different organizations and experts, both from the medical field and from the penal reform field, that submitted expert testimony and opinions. Fabio, can you say a little bit about your sense of the extent to which the Brazilian judicial system will be receptive to these expert opinions, particularly that draw on comparative examples of, for example, the treatment of prisoners in Irish prisons during the COVID-19 pandemic?
In my opinion, it's so important to bring all this information because somehow a lot of judges here, they are not aware of how dire is the situation inside Brazilian detention facilities. The torture, inhuman treatment, this is perpetrated in systematically and daily basis, you know, when you serve spoiled food, when there's lack of water, poor sanitation, inadequate conditions of hygiene, no basic items. This and this place is so severely overcrowded. It's important to understand that and to sensitize the judges, also the prosecutor attorneys, because many of them take that hard-handed approach, and to understand that we must follow, especially for non-violence defendants, alternative measures. We must implement and foster decisions that could bring like house arrest and electronic monitoring, because at the end of the day, unfortunately, the system is racist, is extremely racist. As Black people, they are overrepresented in prisons, and they are also targeted by the system. When it comes to police brutality as well, just if I can add here, just last year, Rio de Janeiro police killed 1,814 people, just the state police. And who were the target? Black young guys who used to live in favelas, in suburbs, the outskirts of the city. So we gotta talk about racism. We gotta sensitize and promote this learning and learn from foreign experience and understand that we don't need to keep this torture and racist system that is in place in detention facilities nowadays in Brazil. We gotta change it. The UN Special Rapporteur, the subcommittee, UN Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture, they've been here, the reports are clear. There are some detention facilities that must be closed, shut down, because they have no natural ventilation, illumination. The cells are the worst possible. So it's very important to bring these perspectives and the good practice from other prison system, and to show, sensitize, mobilize also social organizations from our country to put and to press the judicial system and the executive branch so that they can improve, and so that the detention facilities must become at least a better place, a place where you can treat people like human. They are not treated like human. It's a great challenge here, and all this experience, this good practice can show us that it's really possible if you really try with transparency. For sure, we need leadership and good management from politicians and from all the authorities to change this status that is totally unacceptable.
Thank you, Fabio. And exactly building on that point about the structural racism within the prison system that you discussed, and you mentioned earlier also how the prison system really reinforces existing inequities in society in Brazil. Irmina, in your amicus brief from OSJI, there's really a highlighting of the ways in which both structural racism and gender discrimination in Brazil impact the experience of those in detention, including in particular Black women, pregnant women, and trans women. Can you elaborate a little bit on the impacts of the COVID-19 outbreak in prisons on these populations and the analysis in the amicus about this issue?
Thank you. Sorry, excuse me. Thank you, Aya. So I think in general, it's worth mentioning that the systemic problems within prisons, such as overcrowding, inadequate health services, and poor living and sanitary conditions, has been dramatically exposed by the pandemic in general. And on the top of that, compared to the wider populations, persons in incarceration are particularly vulnerable and at a higher risk of contracting the virus, which can spread rapidly in confined spaces. And here I would like to draw your attention to a few overarching principles of the right to healthcare in prisons, which is the equivalence of care that I mentioned, that people in detention earlier, that people in detention should have access to the same level of medical health care as the wider population. There's the need to take into account needs of prison population, and also the principle of non-discrimination, including on such grounds as race, gender, sexual orientation, and identity, and more. Overall, women prisoners constitute a vulnerable group in prisons due to their gender. This is mainly because women may have gender-specific healthcare needs that often cannot be adequately met. For instance, when we talk about elderly women or pregnant women, and this might put them into a COVID-19 risk group. There might be also instances of sexual abuse and violence against women in prison, or there is a high likelihood of having caring responsibilities for their children, families, and others, which might become also difficult to be guaranteed when we talk about the pandemic and when the space within prisons it might become problematic. Often the gender is also linked to intersecting inequalities such as ethnicity, race, age, disability, and now that we look, now that what we see in Brazil. And that's why we also decided to focus on this issue in our amicus, is that in recent years, the numbers of incarcerated women has increased exponentially, also including for non-violent offenses. And second, there is an ongoing discussion that in Brazil that Fabio just mentioned about the racism and gender inequalities in wider population, which is reflected as well in the prison population. So therefore, we took the opportunity to, in our amicus brief, together with Connectas and Elas Existem, to highlight the obligation of the state to guarantee the healthcare in prison, and that it is provided to all without any discrimination, including based on race and gender. And that in particular, under international human rights standards, Brazil should adopt gender-responsive policies in the prison system, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic, to protect health and life of women, irrespective of their gender, race, and disability, age, etc. In our amicus, we provide data and we cite exact numbers. So maybe I will skip this here. But I just would like to also mention that we also took the opportunity in our amicus to highlight the specific needs, especially this relating to safety concerns of the LGBTQ+ population in Rio and in Brazil, in prisons, who remain currently at even a greater physical risk during the pandemic. because of the need to guarantee social distancing, and for example, providing separate cells for them might be difficult, and that might go against human standards developed in this regard, and also their safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Irmina. And we do have a concluding question, but I wanted to turn to a question from the audience before going there. And this is directed to Fabio about whether or not Brazil legally recognizes the right to healthcare in general. And so whether or not this is about the legal system already recognizing a right and extending that to the context of the prison system, or if it would be establishing the right from the start.
Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah, health in Brazil is a universal right and is a state responsibility. But Brazil is one of the most unequal countries on the planet. No, just last week, a survey was released. In the state of Rio de Janeiro, 82% of its population earns less than $400 per month, 82%. And my state's not a poor state here. Less than 400, they make less than $400 and live with that. 82%. So this is, the thing is how Brazil will be able to scale all this inequality and to guarantee the universal coverage of this gigantic territory. And of course, some places are overlooked, some places are forgotten. And I can say clearly that aside this difficulty, this structural difficulty, the limited budget, racism is there, and this and it's important because we don't really see a lot of public policy towards persons deprived of liberty. No, here, as in many countries, they are very marginalized, stigmatized, and lots of politicians speak openly that the image should die. So the situation is quite difficult, the political situation here, as we have lots of far right wings government nowadays at different levels. The rights of persons deprived of liberty are at a greater risk right now, and it includes the right to healthcare.
Thank you, Fabio. And I also wanted to give you both a chance to reflect a little bit on the partnership and relationship between your two organizations, so the Public Defense in Rio de Janeiro and OSJI as an international organization. And you have a long history of working together, so if you could elaborate a little bit on that and the nature of this collaboration.
Thank you, Aya. So maybe I'll start. So yes, we have a long history of working together. Well, it goes back to 4 years ago, and I have to admit that it's quite a unique partnership, I guess, both probably for my organization and for Fabio's organization, because it's a partnership of a public authority, a state body, and an international non-governmental organization. I think so we've been working extensively together on a number of issues, focusing like building together the human rights advocacy strategies relating to different human rights challenges in Brazil, and we also focused extensively on building together litigation projects to address the systemic problems within the criminal justice system, such as torture or the issue of extrajudicial killings and race. So here, mainly what we as Open Society Justice Initiative provide is this international and comparative perspective. And I think it's great to see how these arguments are actually then implemented by Defensoria Publica in the cases and being tested before the public authorities and courts. Fabio?
Yeah, for sure. I must say this is such an important partnership for us from Defensoria Publica. Working together with OSJI, we managed to perform and implement the first exam on victims of torture here in Brazil, following the Istanbul Protocol guidelines, the first one in Brazil. And we've been working, trying to address racism, police brutality, torture in army facilities. And this was so important because we started to think and always try to seek impactful actions and practice. Because as I told previously, we have a sheer workload. We work from housing to criminal defense and civil, and we need to choose which are the most efficient and the best ways that we always have to ponder the cost effective of the actions, our staff, our budget, our time, and we understand how important and how crucial this is to really promote lasting social change. So this is very important personally and to my institution.
Thank you both. And Fabio, I wondered if you could say a little bit about, this case is obviously focused on Rio, that this is where you're based, but if you've also had discussions with public defense offices in other states in Brazil, if there's also sort of a national movement in terms of working to address the situation of prisoners in prison during the pandemic or more broadly.
Yeah, for sure. I've been the head of the National Human Rights Commission of Public Defenders, and we work closely and together trying to tackle these issues, because this is not a Rio de Janeiro problem. The lack of information, lack of accurate data, this poor health care, and all this is not a Rio de Janeiro peculiar thing. No, it's all scattered across, and fortunately we can find public defender's office in all the states of our country. So we work very close. We work together. There are some national measures. Recently, we were trying to present lawsuits with other organizations and civil society organizations before the Supreme Court, trying to address the police brutality here and trying to get some good precedents, some leading case that could like raise awareness of all the country about something that would be replied in every state and city. So we've been working together. Everything I say here is something that unfortunately we can find all around the country.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Fabio. So we have just a couple of minutes left if there are any remaining questions from the audience. And I also wanted to give Irmina and Fabio, if there's anything that you didn't have the chance to share that you'd like to speak on at this point.
If I may, Aya, just to mention that Open Society Justice Initiative also published a legal brief on healthcare in prisons during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's available online in different languages, and it's also draws on international and regional human rights standards and apply this public health lens together with the policy recommendations of the WHO. It's available online. I'm happy to distribute it if if it's of interest.
That'd be really great, Irmina. And I'm just popping into the chat for, hopefully for everyone to see. This isn't the report that you've just mentioned, but this is all the materials about the case. And so there might be on this link, or again through justiceinitiative.org, for people to be able to search for that report. Can you repeat the title of that again, Irmina?
So, in addition to the case files that you just shared, we also published a legal brief on access to healthcare in detention during the COVID-19. I'm happy to share it as well.
Perfect, thank you. Great. Well, thank you so much again to both of you, Fábio Amado De Souza Barretto from Rio de Janeiro and Irmina Pacho calling in from Berlin, for your incredibly insightful and helpful contributions today and for sharing the details of this case, both from the domestic perspective and also the international human rights framework as well. So thank you for that. And thank you to our audience for joining us today, and to our future audience who watches this in the recording at some point in the future. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.